Well, hello everyone, welcome to part 2. If you were just listening to part 1, welcome back, congratulations. And, well, let's carry on with our questions, shall we? See how far we go. Reichspeer Minister asks, regarding my breechblock question and your answer previously, how and what did it take to go from a breechblock gun position like you showed in the video, that would be one of the Mary Rose's guns, to a pre-Dreadnought battleship turret? I assume it wasn't as straightforward as I thought, since there were ironclads that had muzzle loaders. And can you recommend any books on that matter? Book-wise, the problem you're going to run into is that almost all decent books on naval gunnery tend to focus on a specific period, whether that be World War I, World War II, 20th century, Age of Sail, etc., etc. So if you wanted detailed books covering everything from the very, very first breech loaders all the way up to pre-dreadnoughts and World War I, World War II, you'd end up buying multiple books. But if you want a good general overview, and in fact one of the very few good general overviews that exist, if you can find a copy of it, because it is a somewhat older publication, the book originally entitled Naval Gun by Ian Hogg and John Batchelor would be my recommendation as a starting place. Now, in terms of the development of the breech block, yeah, there is a bit of complication. So you have the original, pick up your breech block, pop it on the end of the barrel and wedge it in place with wood, which was the procedure in the 1500s. And then that goes away when you get mass-scale iron guns and generally mass-scale artillery, because it's difficult, it's dangerous, it tends to leak quite a bit. There's all sorts of issues with that form of breech loading when you're looking for rapid fire reliability. Breech loading then realistically only really starts to come back into vogue in the 1850s and the 1860s, but it suffers from a few major problems to start with. This is the infamous 110-pounder breech block, and one of the biggest problems with a lot of early breech loading weapons is, as you can see, especially at the top, the entire breech is on a very long threaded screw fitting, which then not only takes quite a while to screw and unscrew, it's essentially a threaded variation on the tap-in and with a wooden wedge that you have way back on the Mary Rose, but also that thing weighs a lot, because you're now talking about a 110-pounder gun as opposed to a culverin. And it had all sorts of issues with leakage, with difficulties in actually setting and seating the thing, and the breech weighs a fair bit as well. You then got essentially two lines of development with breech block guns. You could have either the sliding breech gun, which is mostly seen on naval vessels going forward on smaller guns, although Krupp just put them on almost everything. And that, as the name suggests, has a big solid block that slides either horizontally or vertically in and out of the way, but it can't provide a fully gas-proof seal in and of itself. So with sliding breech block guns, you need to have either the entire propellant, or in the case of a larger battleship grade weapon, at least the last element of the propellant charge in a brass case, because then the brass case goes in and the sliding breech block essentially seals and deforms that brass so that it does then provide a gas-proof seal. The other method of breech block development was still with screw threads, and what they did was what's called the interrupted screw thread. So part of the breech and the barrel are threaded and part of it is not, so you turn them out of alignment, you can then pop the breech block in and then you turn it again and it is now sealed. This allows you to shorten the breech block, which means it can now be mounted on a hinge, which makes it much easier to open and close, but still a single set of interrupted threads, you still need quite a lot of them for a secure seal, so the breech block is still relatively long. So although this system is technically invented in the very late 1840s, early 1850s, and adopted in some navies, it's still a little bit cumbersome and unwieldy until towards the end of the 19th century they developed the Welin breech block, which is also an interrupted screw thread, but has varying radii of interrupted threads, which allows considerably more of the barrel to be threaded, which means the breechblock is much, much shorter, and that leads to the kind of interrupted screw breechblock that you're most familiar with on pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts. Andrew Dederer asks, what factors drove the trend toward emphasizing pivot guns on wooden warships in the 1850s? Shell guns had already become much deadlier, so why go all in on a couple of really big guns? Was it better accuracy and slightly better range, or were they part of taking advantage of steam propulsion and the consequent freedom to maneuver? A lot of it depends on the type of ship, because on the ships of the line, broadside guns were still mostly predominant, with a handful of pivot guns fore and aft as useful bow and stern chasers. On smaller ships, perhaps frigates, and then going down to sloops and gunboats and so forth, pivot guns were a lot more popular, as you can see here. And part of this was that a lot of smaller ships were paddle propelled, and so they would have an interrupted broadside, so maximizing the number of guns you could get in your remaining limited space was good. But another part of it was the general increase in size of gun. As you can see here, this is a considerably larger weapon than your average 24 or 32 pounder, which had been a common weapon only a couple of decades before. It wasn't really much to do with accuracy or range, although obviously a deck-mounted pivot gun could be elevated further to shoot further for shore bombardment missions. It was more to do with the fact that with the older weapons, so your standard cannon of age of sail ships of the line and frigates, the number of guns was important because you're essentially mostly just firing big lumps of iron at people, and you're also limited by how heavy the cannonball you can actually handle in a seaway. Whereas with explosive shells, although the weight of explosive they contain is relatively small, the volume that explosive takes up is, relatively speaking, large compared to the same weight in iron if it was solid shot, and therefore overall the size of the shell, if you've got a reasonable amount, 4 or 5 pounds of explosive or more in it, is going to be somewhat larger, and thus the gun has to be larger to fit the shell, and thus the gun itself gets larger. And then especially on smaller vessels, the gun gets large enough, as you can see here, that having one on each broadside would be very expensive, very heavy, and potentially interfere with each other. And so it's better, instead of having 2 smaller shell guns, which are manageable on each broadside, perhaps to have one larger shell gun in the middle, which can fire much more powerful shells, which, kind of like what the Japanese were trying to do with the Matsushima-class cruisers at the end of the 19th century, would make smaller vessels, at least in some way, a threat to larger vessels, because they can now fire explosive shells of considerable power that can do potentially a lot of damage. Plus, it's just cheaper to have the one gun. ConeLed asks, in the most recent Drydock, you indicated that Drydock size is an important practical restriction to how big a ship can get. Looking at it, a modern Ford-class supercarrier is about 1,100 feet long. I'm curious, is there a technological or operational limitation on how big a ship can get? As you've indicated in the past, for example, that about 100 planes is the largest practical air group that a carrier can operate. What kind of technological and operational concerns would limit the size of a ship, assuming that you could build it? Is it technologically feasible to build an aircraft carrier or a battleship the size of Habakkuk out of steel, and would it be able to operate practically? And what about something larger? Well, as a species, we have built ships considerably larger than an 1,100-foot carrier. I mean, there's the USS Enterprise, which is about the same size as a Ford class, or was, I guess, these days. And there you have at the top the Knock-Nevis-Yara Viking-Seawise Giant-whatever the heck they were calling it on any particular day of the week, the longest ship that so far has ever been constructed at just over 1,500 feet. So that's about 36% larger than a Ford class, at least by length. Now, when it comes to limitations, as I said, dry dock is very important because you need a dry dock that's big enough to fit your ship for refit. You also kind of need a slipway or whatever else you're using to build the ship that's big enough to build it on, although that can be gotten around by building the ship in sections. Now, In terms of technological and operational limitations, if you're just going for really, really big ships, you are going to run into operational limits long before you run into technological limits. One of the big problems with the picture says knock never, so we'll call it that. I always grew up viewing it as the Yara Viking, but whatever. The big 1,500 plus foot oil tanker was that she was just too big for the vast majority of ports on the planet. She had to operate on mooring buoys for the most part, which is a significant problem if you are a warship that needs to resupply quite regularly, unless you want to go back to, Age of Sail style, running small boats up next to it. So if you want to build your hypothetical uber warship, the first thing you're going to have to do is engage in the world's biggest dredging and expansion work to whichever dock or port you want to have as its home base, and probably do that, unless you're making the thing nuclear powered, to several other ports around the world. And then you have the technological side of things, which is that if you're building something out of steel, there is an ultimate tensile limit to steel. And if you've ever seen any of the YouTube videos where somebody has, on one of these really big cargo ships or tanker ships, set up a camera looking down a long corridor while the ship's moving, you can see the whole ship is bending like a wet noodle as it moves. That's not particularly good for watertight integrity, or indeed, a lot of different things that warships depend on. You can make the ship's hull more rigid than what, to be honest, a lot of the time are fairly cheaply built container ships. And you're going to have to, because one of the other things is a lot of these container ships are moving in the tens of knots, between 10 and 20 knots. If you want to take a ship up to 30 plus knots, it needs to be a lot stronger, because it's going to be subject to a lot more stress. And that means different methods of construction, different frame spacings, different types of girdering within the ship's overall construction, different thicknesses of hull, different thicknesses of structural members, but it's within our technological capability, theoretically, to build a 15 or 1600 foot aircraft carrier or battleship if we so desired, subject to the operational limitations, etc. we talked about before. It would take quite a while before you get up to the point where you're hitting the steel physically cannot be built as a structure this size without it collapsing in on itself point. And, but long before that, you'd end up in a position where more and more and more of your ship is just massive steel elements or whatever other material you're building it out of. Now, HMS Habakkuk, one of the variants planned about 2,000 feet long. Yeah, you could do that in steel. It would be a very substantial, very difficult construction, but you could do it. Of course, Habakkuk was never designed to move particularly quickly, which makes things easier. If you wanted to make a Habakkuk-sized 30-knot carrier, oh boy, somebody's going to get paid a lot of money for the engineering analysis on that one. The stresses that that ship would be subject to would be immense, especially in bad weather. But as I said, your single biggest problem is just going to be finding ports that you can actually put the thing in, unless you want to make it a permanent resident of the high seas. Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, I've long been puzzled by the structures that appeared on US standard battleships in the 1930s. I've assumed it housed some kind of fire control director, but photos show a lot of window frames and steel in the way to do that conventionally. European ships, by contrast, had neat little revolving directors, whilst the US structures look like split-level suites for admirals who don't suffer from motion sickness. If these things did house director controls, how could they possibly work? These large structures, which can be seen here atop USS Colorado, they are still rangefinder and director platforms. So from the top, the very top, the smallest one is the rangefinder platform, and then immediately below that is the main battery director, and obviously they're duplicated fore and aft. And then on the lowest level, the largest one, you actually have multiple secondary battery directors, usually two, one on each side, and space to maneuver around them. Now, you are correct. If you look at HMS Repulse, HMS Barham, and other similar ships that are refitted around about the same time, modernized during the interwar period, they have multiple levels, but multiple levels of rather distinct small steel, basically look like mini conning towers, but they're basically small steel director towers, and then the rangefinder on top, which looks a lot neater and a lot more compact. Now, with the US, you've got multiple secondary directors, which is why the lower platform is so large, but also this very bulky appearance is a little bit deceptive, because yes, there are the windows and everything, but when you look at the details in something like, say, a booklet of general plans, you'll notice that actually what's going on is that whereas with the European approach, generally speaking, you have a platform with relatively minimal guard railing, etc., and then your little tower in the middle. On the US ships, what they've done is you can probably, hopefully, just about see a line just below what looks like a set of windows. So below that line, there is a much larger sheet metal barrier, kind of like what you would find if you go up to the O10 or O11 levels on a US fast battleship that's a museum ship these days. And then the bit above that line going up to the next level, so which is also the bit where all these little windows are, that's actually marked on the plans as canvas, and the bit around the rangefinder at the top is entirely marked as canvas. So essentially this is a form of shelter for the people operating inside, but which can be removed in the event that you need to in combat or whatever. But obviously with the US operating in the Pacific, which is quite hot, the ability to shade everybody and the equipment in more general terms, it would obviously be highly appreciated. And then the windows are there for looking out of and for ventilation as well, but are entirely removable. So if we switch over to this picture, which shows Colorado second in line, this is that famous picture where USS Pennsylvania is leading a whole column of US standard battleships. And then you look to the very top, you can see here that the rangefinder canvas has been completely dropped. The largest platform, the secondary platform there, you can see they've also dropped the canvas there. You can see basically the guardrail and then the little bumps of the two secondary battery fire control directors there. And it looks like in this case on the main battery director platform, which is the platform that's immediately above those two very wide yard arms that are sticking out there, that looks like they're either in the process of taking it down, or maybe it's still up, or maybe there's something else there, but it's not been built all the way up as high as it could be. So this gives you a bit of an idea about what they'd look like in combat conditions. And if you look at some of the other really high-res photos of Colorado in World War II, discoloration, sunlight, and wind makes the canvas set parts a lot more visible, and that reduces the overall apparent bulk quite considerably. Switch 374 asks, if the Iowa-class battleship's design had not been constrained by the artificial beam limit of the Panama Canal, which limited them to 108 feet in beam, what would have been the most likely set of dimensions for them? Are there any proposed designs? And if not, what is your best estimate, assuming a similar length? I can't find any proposed more than Panamax Iowa designs in their design series from a brief inspection. However, there is a design within the Montana design series that potentially could be something resembling an unrestricted Iowa. And that's because in the design series from 1940, when they were looking at, okay, forget Panamax constraints, the smallest design, because bear in mind, obviously, they were looking at what would become the Montana, much larger, but the smallest one is the design codified as BB6510. Now, that has 9 16-inch 50 guns in 3 triples, so that's Iowa's armament. It's 48,000-ton standard displacement, so close to Iowa. 830 foot long, 112 feet wide, so actually not that much wider than a pre-existing Iowa, with a target top speed, unfortunately, of only 28 knots, because that's what they thought they could fit on that kind of displacement. If you want a non-Panamax compliant 9-gun design that is 33 knots, then you have to look at BB65-2, again, 9-gun armament. but this time its standard displacement is 53,500 tons, with an actual probable displacement of around 63,000 tons when loaded. This thing is 980 feet long, it's 113 foot wide, and as I said, it gets up to 33 knots using 212,000 shaft horsepower. And since it's unrestricted by the Panamax restrictions, then they can also fit enough armour to have an immune zone against its own guns, which means the belt is 15 3/4 inches thick with a 5.5 inch thick deck armour. So that's one possibility. But if you look at pretty much all US fast battleship plans at this point, they are, even with the Montanas and their subvariants, to a degree still influenced by the Panamax constraints. They all have this approximate hull form, which you can see actually very well demonstrated by Ira in the picture, where you have a relatively long, narrow bow, then almost a slab-sided amidships, and then a rather wide but rapidly curving stern. And this is something of a compromise. If you look at previous US battleship designs, when they're either not constrained by the Panama Canal or they're approaching the constraints but they're not actually hitting them, the Lexington class battle cruisers is a good example, and you look at their overheads, you'll see that the hull profile at that point is much more similar to the kind of elongated, almost like a human eye profile that you see on pretty much all other battleships. So I suspect if they'd had completely unrestricted design influences, then you would have had a completely different hull plan, and at that point the dimensions could be completely different, because with the better hydrodynamics you could either make the ship faster for the same length and power plant, or you could make it a smaller vessel, cheaper, and therefore cheaper vessel at the same speed, or various measures in between. PH5817 asks, coal burning boilers with oil spraying, was that a feature used continuously, or was it some kind of boost mode? And how long could the boost be maintained, and what kind of extra speed would it grant if it was a boost mode? Does it have a positive effect on clogging? For the bulk of boilers that had mixed firing within the same boiler, the oil spray was near enough a continuous feature. There were some very early mixed-use boilers where the oil spraying was a kind of, like you said, an optional boost mode, but that was more down to the fact that those ships carried relatively limited amounts of oil, even compared to the fully mixed-use ships, which still carried relatively small amounts of oil. In terms of positive effect on clogging, yes, because everything burned at a slightly higher temperature, you would get less ash, so you could spray it over. Sprayed oil over coal would give you less ash and clinker buildup, which was better, as well as because obviously everything is burning at a slightly higher temperature, there's a bit more thermal efficiency being gained from burning the oil. You'll get a bit more power. The reason why you don't tend to use it as a boost mode is because these mixed-use boilers, obviously, they have a greater power output overall and they're more efficient, and you design the power plant of your ship to the speed that you want that ship to go at. So if you then don't use the oil firing and you're just down to coal, you're actually going to end up with a suboptimal boiler, not just in terms of you won't get as fast, but also the boiler will have been designed to burn at the temperature and rate that includes the oil spraying. So the boiler itself will also be suboptimal. So it's actually a pretty bad idea not to have the oil spray going, unless you're one of those very, very early prototypes. And to give you some idea of the difference that would make, the Lord Nelson class, for example, the first British battleships that carried the mixed fueling system, if they just burned their coal, they had a range of just under 10,000 kilometres, or just about under 5,400 nautical miles. Once you use the oil, as the increased efficiency and the fact you've got all this extra burnable mass, almost doubles the range. The range jumps to 17,000 kilometres, or just under 9,200 nautical miles. Todd Webb asks, if the Dreadnought hadn't been invented at essentially the same time as the semi-dreadnoughts, is there a chance that the main gun size could go up on semi-dreadnoughts to 14 inches or larger to solve the semi-dreadnought problem with splashes being too similar in size between a 12-inch and, say, a 9.2-inch? It's a possible escalation, but it's only an escalation that would take place if pre-Dreadnought armour schemes started going up to a point where it was actually worth having the extra armour penetration of the much larger gun. Because if you can still just penetrate the same amount of armour, then either you're going to see basically the Dreadnought type come about, but just with the secondary batteries being upgraded pretty much like the Satsuma class, or if gun power across all calibers is just gradually increasing, if no one bothers to ramp up the armour all that much, you might see something like a 9.2 inch become a standardised gun, at least for a short period until range increases make it obsolete as a battleship weapon, much like the Germans had actually tried to do with some of their pre-Dreadnoughts with 9.4 inch guns in the 1890s. But as ranges are going up, then the armour penetration of smaller guns is going to drop quite considerably anyway. So essentially, once semi-dreadnoughts are invented, either range is going to increase or armour is going to increase, and one or both of those is going to very rapidly leave you with a dreadnought type anyway. And the other thing is you'd also have to have a fairly major size increase in terms of the ships. Because if you look at, say, HMS Dreadnought, so rough comparison, she has 10 12-inch guns. HMS Orion, she has 10 13.5-inch guns. Now, granted, Orion has them all on the centerline. Dreadnought has some of her main armament on the wings. But nonetheless, they're both carrying 10 main guns, except that Orion is 4,000 to 5,000 tons heavier. And the difference between the Florida class and the New York class, which again is 10 guns of 12-inch caliber up to 10 guns of 14-inch caliber, is 5,000 tons. So a pre-Dreadnought like the Lord Nelson's, which is 15 to 16,000 tons normal displacement, whilst granted you're only upgrading 2 twin turrets, you're still going to be adding a lot more weight, because it's not just the weight of the guns and the turret, you're also talking about the increased barbette weight, the increased weight of your shells, the increased size of the magazines, and all the engine power you need to shovel that through the water, plus of course the increased amount of armour you'd need to resist similar guns. So it would be possible, but I would say much less likely than someone accidentally inventing something similar to Dreadnought along the way. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns asks, in your video HMS Hood, Origins of a Legend, you mentioned about the Royal Navy finding the barrel for the breech-loading 18-inch L40 being too short for a modern British battlecruiser. Is this because of the muzzle velocity being 2,270 feet per second? Essentially, yeah, the British had looked at the performance of the 18-inch 40 caliber gun, and amongst other things, they'd noticed that at 30-degree elevation, which, okay, was the modern elevation for ships. Obviously, Hood was planned with 30-degree elevation for her, as it turned out, 15-inch guns. But at that elevation, thanks to the lower muzzle velocity, in spite of having a heavier shell, and therefore theoretically retaining more energy the further it went, the 18-inch 40 at 30-degree elevation actually shot slightly shorter with contemporary shells than the 15-inch 42 did with contemporary shells, which is a bit of a problem because obviously they're expecting ranges to increase, and the 15-inch 42 was already a relatively short barrel weapon comparative to the regular kind of 45 to 50 caliber barrel lengths. So it was pretty clear that the 18-inch L40 was a one-off for the Furious class, and in fact they only ever made 3 of the things, basically one for each end of Furious plus a spare, so it very clearly was not intended to be a production run for potential future capital ships. And indeed, when you look at the designs for Hood when she was carrying 18-inch guns in the design stages, they were already looking straight immediately at 18-inch L45s. And of course, with a lower muzzle velocity, it also becomes suboptimal armour penetration. Now, that's not to say the 18-inch 40 was completely lacking in armour penetration. It's still an 18-inch gun, but an 18-inch 45 would have significantly better armour penetration, which was an important consideration. Nathapon Hong Sharon asks, in the NavWeb section on the British 15-inch .42 caliber gun, it says in comparison with the German 38cm gun that the German guns on Baden are not relineable. How would they fix worn-out guns then? Well, that British report goes on to note that the German guns are somewhat lighter than the British 15-inch guns, but in part that's because they are just built for essentially one-and-done shooting. And the British report goes on to suspect, and broader investigation also supports the idea, that if you build a gun that's not designed to be relineable, you just build a lot of those guns, and when one of them wears out, you take the barrel away, as in the entire gun barrel, lift the gun out of the turret, and replace it with a brand new gun. And when you look at the production runs of a lot of different guns, you'll see that quite often, in fact almost all the time, navies would order far more guns than are strictly needed for the capital ships that are going to wield them. I mean, we even saw just a moment ago with Furious. Furious had 2 guns, but they built 3 to have one as a spare, and that's with guns that theoretically are relineable, because of course it's easier, even in a relineable gun's case, to go, okay, right, you need a new liner. Well, we'll just take the whole gun out, take it off to be relined, and give you a pre-prepared, brand new, already lined gun, and you can get back out really quickly, rather than having to sit around with half your armament taken off waiting for it to all be relined. The Germans just seem to be taking it one step further along with essentially disposable guns. If they're not relineable, you just build a big bunch of them and then presumably recycle the worn-out ones for other purposes. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, whilst I agree that with your point that those who contend the Royal Navy was ineffective at dealing with massed air assaults don't really know what they're talking about, is Operation Pedestal a fair comparison to the Pacific? U-boats strike me as a bigger threat in the Mediterranean, and whilst equally deadly, the adjective I would use to describe Axis air sorties in the Mediterranean would be prolonged rather than massed. U-boats are absolutely a very dangerous threat, and of course the Italian submarines as well, in the Mediterranean. However, when you look at the really important convoys, Pedestal, Harpoon, Vigorous, etc., it's a little bit of an odd dichotomy in that some of the biggest and nastiest losses in terms of warships, like HMS Eagle, are lost to U-boats, but the vast majority of the merchant ship losses are still lost to air attack, as are a good chunk of the warship losses. But when it comes to the Axis air sorties, prolonged and massed both apply. So when you look at Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, etc., basically all the 1942 carrier battles in the Western Pacific, one thing that you'll notice quite often is that when you add up the total number of strike aircraft, i.e. dive bombers and torpedo bombers, that go in any one particular attack on any one particular ship or formation of ships, you're almost always talking about somewhere between 10 and 20 strike aircraft. And occasionally, very occasionally, you'll get concentrations a little higher than that, but usually only once per battle. And quite often you'll get strikes that are actually under 10 aircraft in terms of the strike aircraft, not counting escorting fighters. Whereas when you look at Harpoon, Vigorous, and Pedestal, amongst other things, but primarily those 3 big multi-convoys, you will see that although, yes, there are multiple Axis attacks per day and multiple days of Axis attacks, all in a row, the individual strike packages are also significantly larger and therefore, fulfill the criteria of massed. So there are some attacks which are less than 20 strike aircraft at a time, usually somewhere between 10 and 15, and occasionally a few less, but those are relatively frequent. You might have 3 or 4 attacks like that per day as little packets of aircraft come in, but each day you will also face anything between 2 and half a dozen major attacks, and those major attacks tend to start at a baseline of 20 strike aircraft, not including escorting fighters, and go up from there. And 30 or 40 strike aircraft in a single attack wave is not uncommon, And sometimes you can get 2 or 3 waves of an attack, which might have, 20 to 30 strike aircraft in the first one, and then half an hour to an hour later, another 20 to 30 strike aircraft, etc., etc. And whereas, very occasionally, as I say, maybe once at Midway, once or twice elsewhere in the Pacific, you might have more than 20 strike aircraft in one location at one time. When you're looking at the Malta convoys, as I said, that's pretty much the order of the day. That's the standard, and occasionally you'll get even more. There are 1 or 2 occasions during the convoy attacks where you have 60 plus strike aircraft all showing up pretty much simultaneously. Now, when you compare that, admittedly, to something like the mobbing of Musashi and Yamato towards the end of the war, when you have half a dozen or more carriers all launching their strike aircraft at a target, maybe that doesn't sound quite so impressive in and of itself, because sure, there could be 60, 70, 80 strike aircraft in those attack waves. But even then, those attacks and that kind of attack on Yamato with Operation Tengo, etc., they all tend to be done in a day. And, well, Yamato's sunk, that's why it's done in a day. Same with Musashi. Whereas you throw that kind of peak level of Axis aircraft at one of the Malta convoys, and they're just like, oh, well, we mostly survived that, admittedly with some pretty heavy losses, but as a formation, we're still here, and it's just going to happen again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that as well. So it all adds up. In a lot of ways, you could almost compare British convoys in the Mediterranean going to Malta in a little bit of a way. Compare it to the London public transportation system, which I have a lot of experience with, both as someone who's worked for Transport for London and someone who has used the services for quite a long time. And, the British public transportation system in London is simultaneously one of the best and worst in the world. It's got one of the highest carrying capacities and transports one of the highest numbers of people per day for a single city public transportation network. But it's also hopelessly overloaded and under-maintained because there are so many more people trying to use it. And likewise, when you look at something like Pedestal, the British are simultaneously fielding dozens of strike aircraft at a time and adding up to hundreds of strike aircraft over several days of continuous attacks. But at the same time, so on the one hand, they're doing exceptionally well against massed air assaults just because they're surviving, but at the same time, it's a massed air assault by hundreds upon hundreds of aircraft. They're taking a fair number of losses as well. Or if you want to be really, really on the nose, Pedestal was attacked by substantially more Axis strike aircraft than Pearl Harbor was. Andronaut asks, was the failure of the Jeune École due to navies unable to get the critical mass of ships needed to make it a viable doctrine? Sort of, but not really. As I've pointed out before, the main problem with the Jeune École is it is a strategy of a weaker navy, and it assumes that the bigger navy won't just respond by building either a counter to the ships that you're building, or just building the same kind of ships as you're building, but more. The fundamental problem with the Jeune École is it assumes a relatively ossified opponent that is never going to change its tactics. And that's simply not the case. In virtually every case where a smaller navy has had to think about dealing with a larger navy, building vast amounts of smaller craft pretty much never works. As I said, because basically the enemy either just builds the same amount of craft but better, or the same type of craft but more. If then opponent is extremely distracted by other events, then you might get away with it, like the Danes got away with a lot of very, very, very small gunboats in the 1800s after both battles of Copenhagen. But that was when the British were so distracted by the rest of the Napoleonic Wars that you just had a few small frigates and the occasional extremely small ship of the line wandering around the area. That gunboat war would not have lasted 5 minutes if the British had shown up with, several squadrons of fifth rates or a single battle fleet with a bunch of third rates and the occasional first rate in it. And it's the same problem with the Jeune École. if there's one thing that history teaches us about smaller navies, is that if you want to be taken seriously and you want to have any kind of power whatsoever compared to the overall hegemon, you have to have your resources concentrated into a relatively small number, because let's face it, you can have a relatively speaking small number of vessels anyway, but you concentrate it into a few very powerful for their type vessels, which is pretty much what the US Navy did in the early part of the 1800s. They could have tried to build a large fleet of sixth rates, for example, and with the resources they spent on the 6 frigates in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they could, theoretically, very well have built 24 sixth rates. And a fleet of 24 sixth rates, come the War of 1812, would have lasted about as long as it took ships like the Indefatigable to show up and go, "Hello, prizes!" Whereas by concentrating their resources in half a dozen considerably more powerful frigates, now admittedly when the Royal Navy showed up full force in 1814, they really weren't able to do all that much about it, but you did get 1812 and a little bit of 1813, where you were able to give the Royal Navy a bloody nose and, check their advance for a bit and make them stop and think about what they were doing. And that's pretty much the case elsewhere. So, look at Sweden. Sweden in the pre-World War I, World War I, and interwar periods could have just focused on Jeune École style, we're just going to build a ton of subs and destroyers. And everyone who tried to do that basically got overrun the minute anyone with a large navy looked at them. Whereas by building some rather excellent coastal defense ships like the Sverige, the Kriegsmarine looked at them and went, yeah, we could win, but it would cost us so much, we'd be immediately kicked to the curb by everybody else we're trying to fight, so we're going to leave them alone. Now, perhaps a Jeune École system where the French looked at, instead of building, well, at that point, ironclads or pre-dreadnoughts, depending on what period you're looking at, but essentially, instead of building battleships roughly equal to the British, they'd gone, okay, well, instead of building, let's say, 10 battleships this decade, we're only going to build 6, but those 6 are going to be really big and really heavily armed relative to the period, and we're going to support them with 3 or 4 dozen torpedo boats. Then we've made a little battle fleet, and that poses a problem for the British, because it's going to be very expensive for them if they try and match the size and scope of our battleships, or they can keep building larger numbers of their regular battleships, but either way, they're going to have to, because of the optics of it, they're going to have to match the battle line portion, and maybe they'll forget about the smaller ships, and that's where the sting in the tail will be. Or even, look at what the Americans were doing in their very, very brief dalliance with the Jeune École before they pivoted back to a more traditional battle fleet with building things like USS Olympia. They were never going to build enough Olympia-type cruisers to come anywhere close to the number of cruisers that something like the Royal Navy could put to sea. But the Olympia is effectively 2 protected cruisers, what USS Constitution was 2 fifth-rate frigates. So that's the way to go, really. Pedden Harley asks, "Greetings from the flight deck of CV-10. I noticed that Yorktown still retains, even after all her refits, 4 open pedestal 5-inch 38 mounts. I presume the 5-inch 38s were retained for their limited anti-surface capabilities versus a near negligible anti-air capability by the end of the ship's career, but would you mind briefly discussing the evolution of anti-surface gun armament from the first carriers to the end of the era that the channel covers? Furious certainly wins for the largest gun carried, but which carrier had the most effective anti-surface armament for the period in which it served?" So anti-surface armament on carriers in the period the channel covers basically falls into 3 broad categories. You have the early era of carriers, where it's near enough expected with certainty that the carriers will meet with some kind of surface-based gun action, whether that's attack by enemy cruisers, enemy destroyers, or both. Then you enter a period where it's considered possible, but less likely. And then you enter the final period where carriers both have long enough range aircraft and sufficient escorts that surface action is basically, if this happens, something has gone so majorly wrong, whether or not we actually have anti-surface guns is probably the least relevant factor at this point. And that can broadly be described as from the start of aircraft carriers through to about the mid-30s, that's the period when they definitely think they're going to be encountering surface vessels. Then from the mid to late 30s through to about halfway through World War II is the period when they think it might happen, but probably not. Although obviously that period has things like the sinking of Glorious in it. And then the latter part of World War II and then on to the 1950s is kind of, if our carriers get attacked in a gun action, we've seriously messed up somewhere. So in the early period, aircraft carriers have weapons that somewhat depend on their status. So if they are straight up conversions from battleships like, say, Eagle, they tend to just retain a portion of the ship's secondary battery. If they are much more developed conversions, such as Akagi, Kaga, Lexington, Saratoga, etc., they tend to try and mount weapons which are commensurate with the cruisers they think they're going to be facing. And to be honest, that's to a certain extent true of some of the earlier carriers as well. Some carriers, like for example Argus, they're conversions of civilian ships. They're relatively small. It's just not seen as giving them a significant anti-surface battery. They've got enough to fend off the occasional destroyer, but that's really it. But when they're talking seriously, essentially up to about 1920, you're looking at 6-inch guns, post-1920 until the Washington Treaty steps in, and then subsequently the London Treaty steps in with various limitations on displacement and gun size. You see carriers mounting 8-inch guns, at least in the Japanese and American navies. The Courageous class are too small to fit 8-inch guns on top of their already limited air group. Now, the approach of the Japanese and American navies is somewhat different, as you can see here with Saratoga. The Lexington and Saratoga essentially have a heavy cruiser main gun battery that's able to fire across deck and across the side, so pretty much the same fire arcs as a regular cruiser does. The Japanese have their guns scattered a bit more all round, so they have slightly more forward firepower, theoretically in the forward quarter, but they don't have as much of a heavy broadside, theoretically, because they position some of the guns on Akagi and Kaga on the second flight deck level. And the important thing to note about all of these is that the anti-surface guns are very distinct from any anti-aircraft weaponry they might carry. Then, as you get into the dedicated carrier designs, the ones that keel up aircraft carriers of any substantial size, so ignoring Hermes and Hosho for a minute, you get Ranger, the Yorktowns, Ark Royal, Soryu and Hiryu, and then obviously Shikaku's, Wikaku, the Illustriouses, and the Essexes. Now everybody's going over to dual-purpose guns. And the interesting thing is that you are still seeing pure dual-purpose. So you're looking at 4.5-inch and 5-inch guns, because that's what people are thinking is big enough to stop destroyers, whilst also being good at long-range anti-air. If they were looking purely at long-range anti-air, you would either be seeing 5-inch 25s, or you would be seeing 3-inch and 4-inch guns almost exclusively, because you can get more of them on, they fire a bit quicker, and they're almost as good at long-range anti-air, but they're still looking at this potential anti-surface role as well. And then by the time you get into full-on World War II, and, well, at that point the only people building carriers are the British, the Americans, and the Japanese in terms of successfully building. Obviously you have Graf Zeppelin, which doesn't enter service, Aquila doesn't enter service as well, etc., Joffre, and so on and so forth. But those vessels, whilst they do retain a dual-purpose battery of heavy anti-aircraft guns, they're now almost exclusively focused on the air, and the reason they're dual-purpose is just because that's the generic anti-aircraft weapon of whatever fleet is building them. Now, in terms of which carrier had the most effective anti-surface armament for the period in which it served, I think there's two potential answers. In terms of absolute theoretical effectiveness, the prize has to go to Saratoga and Lexington, because they're effectively heavy cruisers that happen to launch aircraft, when it comes to their anti-surface armament. They've got the biggest battery, the best broadside, and they've got the fire control systems to manage it. Whereas if you want to go by most effective anti-surface armament in terms of actually got to use it in its intended role, even if it's a dual-purpose battery, then the prize either has to go to HMS Formidable for getting off a broadside at Matapan, or potentially HMS Unicorn for getting quite a lot of broadsides off, shooting up surface targets on the Korean coastline. Ibereg asks, a while back I ran into a report about the Battle of Kula Gulf that claimed that the Japanese task force was able to spot the Americans first at 0106 with the help of the radars of the destroyer Nizuki. What is the likelihood of this claim simply being the result of a statistical error with the timing? I looked into it as best I could, and actually I think there is probably a certain amount of mileage to this. Nizuki was, when she was fitted with radar, the Japanese were very keen to experiment with what her radar could do, and she actually also, previous to the actual main battle of Kula Gulf, but on the same night, scored what's possibly the longest range torpedo kill in history when she torpedoed the USS Strong, which was a destroyer, using a fix primarily gathered by her radar. So her crew seemed to have been pretty experienced with using her radar, and of course as a destroyer, she's a relatively small target for a radar return compared to a large formation of destroyers or, a formation of cruisers and destroyers. So given that she is one of the relatively few radar sets available to the Japanese at this point aboard their small craft, and the fact the Japanese are noted to be particularly eager to experiment with her, it seems that she's probably got an elite crew aboard when it comes to managing her radar. She's already proven her fighting capability using that radar earlier in the night, and when you look at the movements of the Nizuki and the companion vessels and what they were doing in preparation before the Americans opened fire, it seems they knew the Americans were out there. Although, obviously, as it turns out, the American gunnery got the drop on them, but they managed to also then return fire with their torpedoes as well, which resulted in the loss of Helena, etc., and so on, because that's more of the whole Battle of Kula Gulf. So, yeah, it's, I think, one of those circumstances when the Japanese did get the drop on the Americans, albeit that overall they didn't utilize the information the second time around quite as well as they did when they were going after the Strong. Brandon Minders asks, can you comment on the accuracy of the following two models? In particular, do we have any information on what the figurehead of Revenge in 1588 looks like? The scale proportion of San Martin also looks a little bit weird. The lower and middle gun decks look very tall, and the fact there's no gun on the main open deck also looks weird. Is it possible to get more information on exactly what these arrangements are? Okay, so the models in question, they're Zvezda push-fit models. They're pretty small, so you can't expect too much from them, but broadly speaking, they're actually surprisingly accurate. So what I've done here is I've taken the closest thing to a side-on picture they have on the links that you sent me and put it side by side with the 3D file of the model that was used in the Armada videos, which was built directly off of actual proper plans. Now, whilst it does look slightly different, part of that is perspective because the shot of the model, the plastic model, is not perfectly side on. It's actually shot from slightly above, which distorts the perspective a little bit. And also, you've got the underwater hull, whereas with the STL, it terminates at the water because obviously then it has to sit on a surface within the 3D animation. But broadly speaking, they've got the shapes of Revenge pretty much spot on. In fact, I would suspect they probably have built their model off of the same set of plans that we built, or I commissioned for Revenge to be built off of. Incidentally, again, if you do happen to want the Armada ships and all the little extras and so forth, so the Armada STLs were used in the video, plus some extras. The guy who actually was commissioned by myself to make those models has also put them on a Kickstarter, so you can get those and plus some extras anyway. But as I said, I don't make any money from that Kickstarter. That's just a recommendation. Now, in terms of the figurehead on Revenge, As far as we know, the figurehead was a fairly generic one for British ships at the time, or English ships, I should say, which would be a rampant heraldic lion. Now, unfortunately, being a push-fit model and them not having any close-ups of it, I can't tell if that's what they've actually put on this little snap bit of revenge, but if they have, then it would be accurate. And then crossing over to the San Martin, with only a slight difference of opinion in exactly what's happening with the forecastle at the very front, just over the bowsprit. Again, they've got pretty close. They've made the gun ports a little squarer, but our San Martin is based off of proper plans. They seem to have probably gotten hold of similar plans again for their version. I think part of what's throwing you off is, when it comes to San Martin looking a little bit weird, is that she is a relatively stocky ship. She has a relatively short length to beam ratio for a ship with 2 gun decks. You're probably more used to much later vessels. And also, again, it's a complete hull model, so you get a lot more of the depth of the ship, whereas on the right, you get the waterline version, which is the 3D model that I got made, and as you can see, it looks a little bit more sensible, even though it is practically the same. Now, as for the reason for there being no guns on the open deck amidships, that would be because this is a relatively cramped deck area, as you can tell by the extent of the quarterdeck and the forecastle, and there's a lot of hatches in the middle, and it's quite heavily built up. The gunnels are quite heavily built up because it's primarily designed at that point for boarding, but on the actual ship, this would have been a firing gallery for arquebuses, musketeers, and small swivel guns and so forth, the kind of thing you can't really depict on either a plastic model or STL designed for small scale, sort of 1:700 scale printing. So there would have been firearms along here, they just wouldn't have been cannon that deserve a firing port, as happens elsewhere on the ship. Robert Knapp asks, if the Fashoda incident had gone hot in the late 1890s, what would the balance of power have been between the Royal Navy and their likely French and Russian opponents? Is it as one-sided as I imagine it would be? Well, firstly, do you have any idea how difficult it is to find anything to do with the Fashoda incident that isn't just hilariously jingoistic propaganda posters from one side or the other? That aside, let's consider some basic balances of forces. So, to prevent us having to go through every single ship in every single navy, we'll just look at, let's say, battleships and armoured cruisers, i.e. the core of the battle fleet at the time of the Fashoda incident. So assuming it had gone hot in the end of 1898, the British, if you include the Royal Sovereigns, would have a total of 17 pre-dreadnoughts or near enough, and another 3 second-class pre-dreadnoughts in the form of Centurion, Barfleur and Renown. So technically 20 modern capital ships. Then they have 8 armoured cruisers, albeit they're quite old Orlando types, and 21 first-class protected cruisers, because remember at this point the British are building large protected cruisers instead of armoured cruisers. In fact, the first of the Cressy class are coming the following year, which is where they restart armoured cruiser production. The French have 6 battleships that aren't ironclads, so we're basically, for the moment, assuming everyone has a reasonable number of ironclads, we're just looking at the modern ships. The French, starting from Brennus, have 6 pre-dreadnought types, of which a good chunk of them commissioned in 1898 itself. But, you know, we've allowed for 1898 commissioning ships in the Royal Navy as well, so it's only fair. And they have 5 armoured cruisers, but no particularly large protected cruisers, certainly compared to the Royal Navy's first-class ones. The Russians have 4 pre-dreadnoughts actually in service. They do have another 3 that are undergoing trials, the Petropavlovsk class, but historically they're not going to commission until 1899. And they have somewhere between 2 and 6 armoured cruisers, depending on whether you count the Vladimir Monomakh class, Admiral Nakhimov and Pamiat Adzova as modern armoured cruisers or not. Which, okay, I mean, given we've got the Orlandos, maybe they're worth considering. So, at that stage, the Royal Navy outnumbers the combined French and Russian fleets by about 2 to 1 in modern capital ships, The French and Russians do have a slight numbers advantage in pure armoured cruisers, and probably the French have a bit more of an advantage still because the Orlandos are relatively old. But the British do have a whole swathe of large first-class protected cruisers, which bring the numbers up, at least, to well within the British having a significant margin of superiority. And then when you go down the line, torpedo boats, destroyers, protected cruisers, ironclads, etc., it's all pretty much the same. So, yeah, while the British technically have a two-power standard going at this point in theory, they actually have a bit more than that at the time of the Fashoda incident. So, whilst the situation would change if the war went on in it through to 1899, because as I said, the Russians would get 3 pre-dreadnoughts come online, the French would also get some heavy ships coming online, but the thing is, at that point, so would the British. So, whilst the statistics would narrow slightly in favour of the French and the Russians, they would still be massively outnumbered by the Royal Navy. Connor Johnson asks, I'm sure this is something that may be covered in a Wednesday video at some point. In the meantime, can we get a very brief rundown on what the New Zealand Navy got up to in World War II? Okay, so very brief rundown. You essentially have 3 and almost 4 large ships in the Royal New Zealand Navy. It starts the war as the Royal New Zealand Division of the Royal Navy, and then becomes the Royal New Zealand Navy officially in 1941, but we'll just assume that the ships assigned to the New Zealand Division count as Royal New Zealand Navy ships for the purposes of this. HMS initially, and then HMZS Achilles obviously fights at the Battle of River Plate against Graf Spee, and then is recommissioned and works her way over to the Pacific as a formerly Royal New Zealand ship as opposed to HMS. Now then, she takes part along with the Royal Australian Navy and elements of the Royal Navy supporting the US in the Guadalcanal campaign and related campaigns. And you also have HMS Leander, which serves initially in the Indian Ocean, then pops over for a brief stint in the Mediterranean, then heads back to the Pacific again, now as HMZS Leander. And unfortunately, although these are the 2 larger ships in the New Zealand Navy at this point, both of them get crippled and knocked out of either a substantial part or all of the war in 1943. Achilles gets hit by Japanese bombers, X turret is destroyed, and she has to go in for quite extensive repairs. She never actually gets back X turret. She ends up having just the 3 turrets with additional anti-aircraft defences put in place of X turret. But she does make it back to participate in the closing stages of the war. Leander, unfortunately, a little bit after Achilles is hit, is torpedoed, and that damage is so bad that Leander has to, well, she's basically being repaired during the entirety of the war, so that's pretty much the end of her war. The reason I mentioned potentially a 4th is that you had another Leander class, HMS Neptune, which was earmarked to join the Royal New Zealand Navy. Unfortunately, while on operations in the Mediterranean, with a substantial number of New Zealand sailors aboard, but before she could get over to New Zealand to commission as HMZS Neptune, she hit a mine and sank. Later in the war, you had HMS Gambia was transferred over as HMZS Gambia, a Crown Colony class cruiser, and she got to participate along with Achilles in the closing stages of the Pacific campaign. And then on a smaller scale, below the cruisers, you have a variety of smaller ships, a lot of them being effectively armed merchantmen, but also a lot of small escorts. And obviously they play a fairly substantial role in the small ship war in the Pacific. For example, you get the incident I've referred to previously on various videos where you have 2 very small New Zealand escort ships taking on a Japanese submarine on the surface, despite the fact the Japanese submarine actually outmasses and outguns both of them combined. They still managed to prevail. That's during the Guadalcanal campaign. Now, of course, the exploits of those up to about 50-60 vessels total by the end of the war could go on for quite a while, but you did say it needs to be brief because it is, of course, a Drydock question. So the only other thing I would caveat onto that is that it's not just the ships formerly flying the New Zealand Navy flag. There are quite a few thousand New Zealand sailors in the general Royal Navy as well. So you could also count their exploits into the sort of overall exploits of Royal New Zealand Navy sailors. But as you said, that will potentially be another video on a Wednesday in the near future, or perhaps the distant future, depending on how my list of things to do goes. Vintage Car History asks, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of associations and organisations were created by automotive engineers, perhaps most notably the Society of Automotive Engineers, or the modern SAE, to share information across the industry internationally about technological advances and various ideas. Was or is there a similar international society for marine engineers, be they military or civilian? Well, there are a variety of national bodies that do accept international membership, like the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, but in terms of truly international institutions that go back at least to the late 19th century, there's two main ones. There's the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, whose symbol you can see here, and there is also the Institution of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology, also known as the Institute of Marine Engineers, both founded in the latter part of the 19th century, and both are still going quite strong today. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh look, Mead asks, I'm currently watching The Expanse, a sci-fi series set mainly in space with a decent amount of spaceship versus spaceship combat, ranging from space motor torpedo boats, dash motor gunboats to space dreadnoughts, and one of the three main weapon types is railguns. In the series, the show has an episode where a railgun fires a round that explodes shortly before impact, showering the target with a hellish storm of high-velocity fragments. This got me thinking, in space combat as seen in this series, what would be the pros and cons of the following types of railgun ammunition? Solid rounds, airburst rounds, i.e. exploding just before impact, HE rounds, and AP rounds. The two other main kinds of weapons used are point defense cannons that fire extremely large numbers of rounds per minute, and torpedoes. So I've watched a fair bit of The Expanse myself, but with regards to the question, railgun ammunition, solid rounds, not massively useful in my opinion. A completely solid round will do pretty much what you see point defense guns doing in The Expanse. It'll punch a hole straight through a ship, because at the kind of speeds that railguns are firing, and you're talking about space combat anyway, in a setting like The Expanse, there is no amount of armour that's going to protect you. At which point, you've got a slightly bigger hole in a ship than a point defense gun could do, except a point defense gun, as you point out, will do thousands of those little holes and probably actually be more effective. So unless you've got a really, 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 really good aim and you're aiming for something that might actually have a degree of shielding on it like a reactor, and you're that good of a shot, solid rounds not really worth much. Airburst rounds, or basically proximity fusing rounds, those are going to be pretty darn effective, because it means that even if your railgun shot slightly misses in terms of its direct line of fire, you're still going to theoretically catch your target with at least part of your spray of shrapnel. And, well, again, relativistic speeds, you're going to be hitting people with a lot of little impacts, which means they're all going to be punching lots of little holes in the ship, which in turn means the chances of you hitting something or someone important have gone up exponentially. Plus, if any of those rounds are somehow small enough to be slowed down or deflected by the internal structure of the ship, then they're going to go pinging around inside, causing all sorts of havoc. High explosive rounds, I don't think they're necessarily going to be all that useful, mainly because when it comes to explosions, they tend to like to vent along the path of least resistance, and there's nothing less resistance than the vacuum of space. So if it's a traditional HE round, i.e. detonate on point of impact, they're not going to be anywhere near as effective as just turning your opponent into a colander. Now, the AP rounds might have a bit more mileage to them, albeit that pretty much anything in this setting would be an AP round, as long as it's not detonating immediately on impact like an HE round. The principle of, punch a hole in your opponent and then cause an explosion inside, which will cause a bunch of shrapnel, which in this case will go almost omnidirectional and basically perform a similar thing to the airburst round, except 360 internally, is a good one. The only restriction compared to the proximity fusing round is, of course, you actually have to score the hit first. My only concern would be, given the sheer speed that the rounds are travelling, and therefore the amount of energy involved in the collision between the ship and the round, whether or not anyone can make a shell that would A, survive intact, and B, a fuse that will work quickly enough for it to detonate within the ship, rather than detonating, 20 kilometers further on after it's just done a nice neat coring job. Snowstalker 36 asks, why was the British Pacific Fleet so behind the curve in underway replenishment in late World War II? Not being in practice and not having a large enough supply fleet makes sense given the Royal Navy focus on having bases around the world to resupply at, but accounts I'm reading say they weren't even trying techniques that were common for the US Navy 3 years before. Well, you pretty much outlined the broad strokes of why the Royal Navy was behind the US Navy in terms of this form of operation. It's simply the fact that in wartime you do not have the time to learn new techniques of doing something which you don't actually need to do at that point. And most of the Royal Navy's combat theatres, the need for significant underway replenishment simply wasn't there. Now, you could argue it might have been useful in something like the Hunt for the Bismarck, where by the end of it everyone was running a bit short of fuel, but in most operations it simply hadn't been a factor. The Royal Navy, as you mentioned, had bases all over the place, and their ships didn't have too bad a range, which meant that, for example, in operations in the Mediterranean, where generally Royal Navy ships had a range advantage over the Italian ships, and the ranges weren't particularly long in the first place, the Italians would have to retire home for a lack of fuel long before the Royal Navy did. And to be honest, most of the time, if one side or the other headed for home, it was for reasons other than they were running out of fuel, because, again, short operational distances. The North Sea, and even to a certain extent the Arctic convoys, are pretty much the same thing. Even going back and forth across the Atlantic whilst doing convoy escort work, generally speaking, it doesn't run you close to being out of fuel for the ships that were dedicated to that work, whether they be cruisers, battleships, or even destroyers. For particularly longer range missions like patrolling areas like the South Atlantic or the Indian Ocean for commerce raiders, particularly when cruisers were doing this, at that point your cruiser might begin to run low on fuel. But for one thing, cruisers, as is in their name, kind of have the longest ranges to start with, and once again, multiple bases mean that you can either call in and top up regularly, or you can do a really big long mission and be fairly confident that there'll be somewhere for you to call in and top up relatively nearby. And without, major operations in and over the expanse of somewhere like the Pacific, essentially the Royal Navy had better things to do than to learn brand new techniques. And you've got to bear in mind that whilst you say the techniques were common for the US Navy 3 years before, they weren't that common, because whilst resupplying destroyers at sea, who were notoriously fuel hungry and had small tanks, was common across pretty much all navies, it wasn't until 1939-1940 that Admiral Nimitz actually devised methods for alongside refueling for much larger vessels. And so the US Navy themselves, by late 1944, had only really been in this business of alongside at-sea refueling for less than half a decade. It's just that they'd had quite a long time at war in the Pacific to perfect their techniques in operational conditions and, uprate the pumps and all this kind of thing, because that's what circumstances forced them to be able to do. Whereas by the time the US Navy had implemented this system of underway replenishment, the Royal Navy was already at war. So, back to my original point, why would they learn a technique they didn't need whilst they're busy fighting the Axis powers? And they can use that time to learn other things. And to be fair, the Royal Navy did pick up on the techniques relatively quickly. As you can see here, this is a couple of units of the British Pacific Fleet doing their underway replenishment in the American style. And the US Navy itself concluded that the British Pacific Fleet was near enough as makes no difference up to US standards by March 1945, which, given that when the British Pacific Fleet got properly ready to get going in late 1944, as you mentioned, they pretty much had no idea how to do this technique, is a pretty steep learning curve. One of the things that is actually very interesting about the British Pacific Fleet specifically is that because obviously they hadn't had a major Pacific war that they were fighting for the last few years, the Royal Navy and the Royal Fleet Auxiliary found itself a little bit short when it came to having enough tankers and other supply ships to do the resupply in the first place. So in that case, they were able to obviously adapt American lessons from refueling from capital ships, but they also actually used a number of escort carriers and loaded them up as purely replenishment vessels with a little bit of an air group stuck on top, which was a rather interesting development because, of course, the escort carriers tend to be, as far as supply vessels are concerned, relatively large. They've got a fairly significant capacity. Escort carriers are obviously much more able to defend themselves than tankers and so forth. And they tend to also be able to move faster than the average supply ship. Now, it was an expedient solution, and it did mean that the escort carriers had less available strike power compared to what they otherwise would have. But it's an interesting little segue about how to improvise, adapt, and overcome for a situation where you need to do a lot of underway replenishment and you just don't have the logistical ships available. Peter Guy asks, while understanding there is a pronounced difference between different armour types in terms of face hardened versus less hardened backing plates, etc., was there a correlation between shell diameter and armour thickness? I note that many battleships were armoured to the same extent as the shells expected to be fired at them, for example 14-inch guns and 14 inches of armour, but that the ships with sloped armour essentially depended on the ship being at an approximately even keel. So if a ship was heeled over to 20 degrees to port, a starboard inclined armour belt would likely have been near perpendicular. Am I incorrect in perceiving that there was a correlation between the depth of armour plate and the diameter of the armour-piercing shell? Certainly for the latter pre-Dreadnought and then the Dreadnought period, you're not wrong. When you get iron plating, compound plating, and early steel plating, and even some of the early pre-Dreadnought period, you actually have a generally fairly significant crossover, because at the start of the iron plate period, armour is ahead of the curve on guns, so you can have 4.5 inches of plate on Warrior, for example, which can stop shells and shot that are coming from gun calibers even up to twice or more as large as the width of the plate on Warrior. But as you move through to the latter part of the ironclad period and then into the compound armour period and so forth, gun technology takes the upper hand, and suddenly you have ships with 16, 18 or 20 or more than 20 inches of armour trying to defend themselves against 13, 14, 16-inch guns. So it's at that point, it's almost on a decade-by-decade or even a year-by-year basis. But once you get into the era of Krupp steel and let's say the later pre-Dreadnoughts and the Dreadnoughts, there is, for a good chunk of that, a general rule of thumb that, yes, in fact, if you want to protect a ship against its own shells, you, broadly speaking, want to have armour that's about as thick as your own shells. Or, if you happen to be ahead of everybody else, you have armour as thick as the enemy's shells. So, for instance, that's why when you look at something like the Orion class 13.5-inch armoured ships, at the time they are the super dreadnoughts, and Germany's only building ships with 12-inch guns, so the armour is, roughly speaking, corresponding to the German gun calibers, give or take an inch or two, depending on the capital ship in question. Plus, once you get into World War I-ish, you're beginning to get to a point where there are slight refinements to armour composition, albeit very slight ones, and battle ranges increasing quite significantly, which is beginning to also drop the necessary thickness just a little bit below the armour versus gun caliber correlation. So you start to see ships like, say, the American Standards, which have 14-inch guns and are designed in a world where they know that there are 15-inch gun ships, but they have 13.5 inches of armour. The Queen Elizabeths and Revengers are 15-inch armed ships, but they have 13 inches of armour. And when you watch the developmental trends go forward, you see with inclined armour coming in, Hood obviously has 15-inch guns, but is now carrying 12 inches of inclined armour. The G3s were going to have up to 14 inches of inclined armour, despite having 16-inch guns, and so on and so forth. The American fast battleships in the 1930s, they're designed initially, in the case of North Carolina, against super heavy 14-inch shells, and then later obviously against 16-inch shells, but they have 12 inches or 12 and a little bit inches of inclined armour, so the inclination has taken over. Even Yamato, 16 inches of armour, 18.1 inch guns. But even so, there is still a correlation. It's just not a direct one. It's a correlation minus 1 or 2 inches. But you're entirely correct for spotting that correlation in the first place. Paul from Chicago asks, what is a first class pass for a lieutenant's exam, or more accurately a lieutenant's exam, in the Victorian Royal Navy? And how does one acquire 5 of them, like Adm Dudley de Chair? So for your lieutenant's exam, there's the basic lieutenant's exam, which you have to pass, but when you're at Dartmouth, as you can see here, circa this year, there are a number of courses that you would have to pass back then, and that consisted of a gunnery course, which was held at HMS Excellent, a torpedo course, which was held at HMS Vernon, a navigation course, which was also down in Portsmouth, so you're spending a fair bit of time away from Dartmouth. Then you had to pop up to Greenwich before it was the National Maritime Museum and get a general educational course, make sure your general knowledge was up to spec. And then there was essentially a leadership course, which is taught directly at Dartmouth. Now, those courses have obviously been modified somewhat since then, but that's what they were back at that point. And at the end of each course, you would get a examination, and you might pass, and you might pass to different degrees. So if you're a first class pass, that meant you're right at the top of your class. You've done the best that could be reasonably expected of you. And to get 5 of them, that means you've passed all 5 courses with a first class pass, which means that you basically are an exceptional up-and-coming officer who knows a good chunk about anything and everything there is to know as far as naval education is concerned, and thus you are probably on the fast track to promotion as long as you prove yourself in the field as well. Ger Variola asks, you stated in a former Drydock, if I remember correctly, that the Kriegsmarine's latest designs for the H-class battleships would have been impossible to build at the time. Now I'm wondering if they couldn't be built at all because of the technology would not allow the vessel to be built, or was it just Germany wouldn't have been able to build them because of economic restrictions? In any case, what aspects would you change to make the design a viable battleship for the mid to late 1940s? Theoretically, almost any of the H-class designs could have been physically built. The problem was that once you get past H-41, the German shipyards do not have a slipway even close to capable of accommodating it. So H-39, H-41, fine. H-42, 43, 44, when you're going 1,000 feet plus, there's just not the slipways in Germany to be able to do them. And when you look at where the slipways in German shipyards are, the vast majority of them back onto something which would make extending them difficult, if not impossible. So that's the main restriction of the bigger H-type designs. You'd have to either come up with some incredibly implausible slipway given the constraints of existing German shipyards, you'd have to build entirely new shipyards, or you'd have to do what was suggested by 1 or 2 people at the time, which was basically to build it almost like they built the Great Eastern and just build it on a kind of a flat bit of ground next to the water and tip the thing in, which again was not something that the German yards were set up for at that point. If I wanted to make a viable mid to late war German battleship, I'd just build the H-41. I mean, it's got 8 16.5 inch guns, so firepower is fine. Admittedly, it's still got, all the H-class designs have this messy mixed 150mm and 105mm secondary battery. I personally would have gone at that point, given that the dual-purpose 127, 128mm wasn't quite ready. Well, it might have been by the time you'd actually build one of these things, so if possible, just go with that as the entirely dual-purpose. But if push comes to shove, rather than have a dozen 150mm and 16 105s, I just go stuff it and have 28 105s. Why not? Or potentially more, considering you've got the deck space for them. The other thing, at least in my opinion, when it comes to the H-classes, is they kept a somewhat anemic armour system. And this isn't even to do with the layout at this point. This is just to do with the fact they seem to have just copy-pasted the majority of the armour layout on H39, which was itself a development of the Bismarck's armour layout, and just gone, well, we'll just have that on bigger and bigger hulls, which, you know, once you get to some of the H-class designs, as I said, you're talking about 16.5-inch guns on 41, you're talking about 18.9-inch or even 20-inch guns for H44. I'm sorry, but at that point, you've run into basically the same problem as HMS Incomparable has, running around with what would have been perfectly fine taking on ships armed with 13 or 14-inch guns, except if you're going to be building ships with 18.9 or 20-inch guns, you're going to end up fighting ships similarly armed. And at that point, I'm sorry, but 12 inches of armour, no matter how fancily you shape it and so forth, is not going to save you. Well, and as you'll see next week, I actually have a plan on how I would have redesigned Bismarck. So if I was redesigning the H-44s, apart from having a uniform secondary battery, I mean, I wouldn't go for H-44 anyway. It's just a stupid boondoggle waste of resources. But if for some reason I thought I might end up fighting a Montana or a Yamato, then H-41 is a perfectly decent place to start with, except I'd also convert it to 3 triples instead of 4 twins, so I get an extra gun and I save some displacement, and I'd use that saved displacement and the saved displacement from just having a uniform 105mm secondary battery in up-armouring the thing. Eric Van Dooting asks, could you contrast the susceptibility of the Yorktown and Lexington class carriers to having their power plants knocked offline by torpedo hits? On the 2 occasions Saratoga was torpedoed by submarines, she appears to have shaken off the damage with relative ease, although a short circuit did cause her to lose power for a while on the second occasion. Yorktown-class ships appear not to have been able to withstand even a single less powerful aerial torpedo if hit abreast the machinery spaces. How do the difference in propulsion systems, beam, and torpedo defence systems all play into this? So firstly, in terms of beam, the Yorktown class are over 20 foot narrower than the Lexingtons. That just means there's going to be less depth to absorb impacts in the first place, which doesn't help. Secondly, the Lexingtons, obviously with that greater beam and being originally battlecruisers, were planned out with a relatively extensive torpedo defence system, including a number of void spaces. Whereas if you look at the booklet of general plans for the Yorktowns, you'll see adjacent to the machinery spaces and boiler rooms, it's just oil, 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 oil. They have some subdivision, but it's nowhere near as comprehensive as even the much older Lexingtons. But to a certain extent, that's to be expected because there's very strict limitations on what you can do with a Yorktown class compared to a ship the size of the Lexingtons. And then finally, you have the propulsion system itself. So Yorktown has all of her boilers concentrated in one area and all of her turbines concentrated in another area. Now, granted, there is subdivision in the bulkheads, but when you combine the fact that she's not got the world's best torpedo defense system and a relatively narrow beam, and all of each type of machinery is concentrated in one place, that means if you do take a hit amidships, you could quite easily either lose all your turbines or lose all your boilers to a mixture of shock and flooding, which is not great. As you point out, this kind of did happen a few times to the Yorktowns, and it got to the point that actually Enterprise, the sole surviving Yorktown, had an additional anti-torpedo blister put on her later in the war. By contrast, the Lexington class, as well as having a somewhat more substantial, i.e. deeper, torpedo defense system, they have all the turboelectric stuff down the middle of the ship and all the boilers running down either edge. Now, that does theoretically make the boilers slightly more susceptible to damage compared to a Yorktown's boilers, which are fractionally further inboard. However, because the machinery is distributed so widely, it means that even if you do knock out some of that machinery, one, you're not knocking out the electric part of the turboelectric system, which is much deeper in the ship, and two, you're only knocking out part of the boiler turbine system that is driving the turboelectric system. And the turboelectric drive, amongst its various strengths, it has the capability of basically redirecting power from other sections. So just because you've knocked out some boilers doesn't mean you suddenly lost a propeller shaft or something. You just go, okay, we'll just take more power from some of the other boilers, keep everything running, that's fine. And of course, the boiler compartments themselves act as a bit of an ablative compartmentalization space for the central portion of the machinery, which is quite handy. The only real vulnerability that the Lexington class has in terms of damage to torpedoes is that the turboelectric system is, of course, as the name suggests, an electrical system, which means that it's possible for a big enough and powerful enough shock in the right place to cause the whole thing to trip out, which, as you mentioned, did happen to Saratoga at one point, and almost certainly also maybe happened to Lexington during the various explosions. Now, of course, that's quite bad because then you have to reset everything, and if the electrical system goes down, that's not going to immediately put out the boiler fires, so it's definitely not a good thing. And, you know, single hit, complete power loss all over the ship, especially not good, but it, at least in the relatively few times that turboelectric drive ship was hit by 1 or 2 torpedoes at a time, doesn't appear to have happened too often, but it is a potential issue. BFW asks, what are some of the longest naval battles and why did they last so long? Well, you do sometimes get people saying the Battle of the Atlantic is a single battle. I tend to disagree. It's a series of battles within an overall campaign. But some of the longest naval battles are also some of the older ones, simply because battles tend to end when one side or the other has a decisive advantage. And that decisive advantage can be because you've destroyed a good portion of the enemy fleet. It can be because one side or the other has begun to run out of fuel, or some kind of objective that one side or the other was trying to achieve is no longer viable. Now, convoy battles, even in the Age of Sail, therefore tended to be over after a set amount of time because, well, either you were in a position to attack a convoy or you weren't. But fuel requirements mean that pretty much nothing in the age of steam and steel is going to last more than a day or so in any one particular case. You know, even multi-day combat operations like Operation Pedestal or the Battle of Leyte Gulf can be broken down into a series of distinct engagements, often between slightly different vessels. And it's not, you know, particularly continuous. It'll be, oh, right, we're under attack in the morning, then we've got a few hours, then we're under attack again, and so on and so forth. But when you go back to the Age of Sail, well, fuel is not really a concern. The rate of fire means that running out of ammo, which is another problem in the more modern era, is probably not so much of a concern. And the relative speed of everything means that shifting from one phase of a battle to another can take quite a while. And so there's a few contenders in the what you might call the proper medieval period before ships have lots of guns, where you have fleets meandering up and down, shooting each other, well, not shooting each other, well, maybe with arrows, but basically fighting each other, boarding, counterboarding, trying to attack each other, which takes, you know, a good part of a day, maybe a slightly more. But I think the winner pretty much has to be the 4 days battle, which is depicted here in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And in fact, quite a number of battles in the various Anglo-Dutch Wars are good contenders for some of the longest naval battles in history, because a number of them do span over either a full day or multiple days. Just the 4 days battle is, by its name, the longest of them. And that's simply because neither side could get a particularly decisive advantage over the other, and their main objective was to clobber the other side into submission. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, if HMS Caroline still had her weapons intact and in working order, where would her main battery land if fired? Now, we haven't had one of this type of question in a while. Unfortunately, it's a relatively boring answer because, for one thing, Caroline's guns appear to be at near enough zero elevation, maybe a couple of degrees if that. And also information on how far her guns would go at those kind of low elevations is relatively difficult to come by, although aggregating similar guns across the period, she probably has about 5,000 yards or so range just firing on the flat or with very slight elevation, which is about 4.6 kilometers. Now, her starboard and port side batteries appear to be roughly aligned, pointing in the same direction on each side. And of course, firing on the flat, the shells wouldn't actually get very far. The starboard battery would demolish some buildings in a car park immediately to her starboard side, and the portside battery would just whip across into what appears to be a large pile of coal and various other industrial dockyard bits and pieces. But again, for the purposes of these kind of questions, we assume that there's nothing intervening in the shell's flight, in which point the starboard broadside would not hit much of anything. It would just land in the sea, albeit it would land in the middle of the shipping channel for the various ferries that come into Belfast. So if there was something coming through at the time, that might get hit. On the other hand, the portside battery would reach out just about to, if you happen to live in or near Belfast, a place called a White House Lagoon, and also maybe make the life of some cars on the M5 motorway next to it rather uncomfortable. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, can you briefly cover rotary wing aviation use in the Pacific in the later stages of World War II? I know the Japanese were experimenting with gyrocopters for anti-submarine use, and I know the US Army used earlier helicopters for rescuing downed airmen in Burma, but are there any other examples of their use within the US Navy, the Royal Navy, or Commonwealth navies? Although helicopters showed up pretty quickly in the immediate post-war environment in the US Navy, Royal Navy, and Commonwealth navies, as far as I know, there was no particular helicopter deployment by those navies during World War II itself. Almost all the references to the use of helicopters by the US and Britain seem to be either the Coast Guard, the US Army Air Force, as it was at the time, or the Royal Air Force, with some experimental work done with autogyros by the Royal Navy, but nothing in frontline service. And then, as I said, immediately post-war, suddenly you have them all adopting helicopters, but that doesn't really help in the latter stages of World War II. Of course, since this is an aerial topic, my research capabilities are a little bit less, so if anybody does know of either specifically the US Navy or Royal Navy using helicopters in an active frontline role as opposed to just being assisted by the helicopters belonging to one of the land-based air forces, then please let us know in the comments below. Duke Master asks, related to the Battleship New Jersey video, what are your thoughts on the USS Idaho full magazine dump? Did the Royal Navy or other navies conduct similar tests? Well, in terms of Idaho's mag dumping, it's a pretty good idea. I mean, as Ryan points out in that video, if the US has designed its battleships with all these shells to be able to sit there and dish out or maximum amount of punishment in an extended either series of battles or a single extended battle against the Japanese fleet, it's probably a good idea to check whether or not it can actually do that. So, yeah, it's a pretty good idea. I wouldn't have wanted to be one of the crewmen having to keep the guns supplied until you'd literally run out of ammunition, but it would have been quite impressive to watch. In terms of did the Royal Navy or other navies conduct similar tests, not as far as I am aware. Although with the caveat that I haven't really looked into that particular little niche subject of gunnery before, but I haven't come across in my recollection anybody going, yeah, you know what we need to do? We need to fire off our entire ammunition load to see what happens. Certainly not in most of the common eras of naval warfare. That isn't to say, of course, there weren't periods when ships did end up firing off their entire ammunition load. The D-Day landings, for example, quite a number of ships shot out their entire ammunition load and went back to the UK coast to get more, and to the extent that some ships even not only shot through several magazine loads of ammunition, but also shot out their guns and needed their guns relined or replaced in addition. Plus, of course, you have the slightly more tragic circumstances of ships like HMS Gloucester in the Mediterranean, which, although she didn't go through all of her ammunition period, she did blow through her entire anti-aircraft ammunition load during the evacuation of Crete, which subsequently resulted in her sinking once she was unable to further resist Luftwaffe air assault. Torino asks, with there being 260 Drydock episodes as of the time of this question, yeah, I know, assuming a conservative estimate of 15 questions answered for every Drydock episode, not counting live streams and other videos, and yeah, it's usually around 15 to 20 questions for a regular episode and around 70 to 80 for these two-parter long ones. You've answered at least 3,900 questions. Yeah, though probably more, definitely. helping spread naval knowledge far and wide. Thank you very much. This got me thinking, with an audience in the hundreds of thousands all across the globe, are there any naval or other historical queries or mysteries that us in the audience can assist you with? Well, yeah, there are a few. I mean, very specifically, if I can't find something that I need for a specific episode or a bit of research I'm doing, I will tend to ask for it directly in some manner, usually on Discord, or maybe on here if it's really difficult. But there are a few things, just as general principles, kind of things to look out for. Firstly, the niche stuff, the weird, not necessarily the weird stuff, but the stuff that doesn't usually get recorded by normal naval history. So particularly family histories. I've mentioned before on the Drydock how much I like looking in at the comment sections when people either who have directly served or their father, grandfather, uncle, etc. served, and they're relating bits of information that those people have told them, or they're directly communicating that information. And a lot of that is going to be personal experiences, either of incidents that are deemed otherwise too minor to record at all, or not recorded in great detail. So, you might have somebody who, in the regular histories, it might say X ship went and conducted preliminary shore bombardment for 2 hours, and that's all the line in the history book you're ever going to get. But someone who was actually there will probably have a considerably more detailed description of what was actually being done during those 2 hours and how it was for them to be doing that. And then it's stuff that isn't even recorded at all, like how the men got along with the officers, or funny incidents where they pulled pranks on each other or smuggled things aboard, or what it was just like living aboard the ship, etc., or what their perspective was on an incident that may be more famously reported elsewhere. All that kind of stuff. Definitely keep that flowing in the comments and via emails, because it's stuff that's never been out there in the public reading before. But in terms of queries and mysteries, other than that, I would say, and this is actually something I was talking about last week with some people, one of the biggest ways that an international audience can help me is by finding books and sources and resources that are usually beyond the scope of the normal English-speaking audience. And the reason for that is that we are limited by what we know is out there when it comes to history. So, even if we know there is stuff in international archives, like Spanish archives or German archives, etc., if you don't read the language, knowing how to ask for something is incredibly difficult, let alone then getting hold of it and then trying to translate it into something understandable for someone who primarily speaks English. And, of course, there is also going to be quite a lot of stuff that is written in various countries' native languages that is not translated into English. And we have, I think, in the English-speaking community, a little bit of a not unconscious bias, I hate that term, an unconscious blind spot, I think is a better term, because you have, obviously, the Royal Navy has quite a lot of history behind it, so there's a lot written about the Royal Navy, and because the Royal Navy spent a good amount of time fighting the French and the Germans, especially Germans in more recent history, there's a lot written about the Germans and the German Navy that's either been written directly in English or translated into English. And similarly for the US, obviously there's a ton of stuff written about the US Navy in English, both countries speaking the English language. And then because of World War II, there's a fair bit about Japan that's been translated, although there's still a fair bit of stuff in Japan about Japanese naval history and shipping, which is still in Japanese and has been translated into the English language, usually because it doesn't relate directly to World War II. But because of the sort of writing both about our own histories in the UK and America and the naval histories of various people we fought for a long time, you can slip into this unconscious idea that, oh, if there's a relevant book out there about X to do with naval history, or history in general, then there will be an English version of it, which isn't actually the case. I mean, as I said, we spent a lot of time fighting France in the UK, and while there is a substantial amount of work about French ships, you'll notice at least in England, there's huge amounts about French shipping in the latter part of the Age of Sail. And nowadays there's a reasonable amount about some of their stuff from World War II. But World War I, when they were on our side, and the steam and then steam and iron period by kind of 1830s onwards to the 1890s, and then obviously into World War I, there's not a huge amount out there. But I know from having been to France and seen some French bookshops, there's actually a lot more out there in French. And as I say, that's a nation where there's a reasonable amount of motivation for English translators to translate stuff into English. We spent a good amount of time fighting the Spanish, but the amount of resources that are available about the Spanish Navy outside of the Armada is very limited. And then you go on to, how many books are there about the Dutch? Even though we fought multiple Anglo-Dutch wars, there's actually not a huge amount about the Dutch Navy in English. And then, expand that out to smaller navies and other navies. There's good chunks of good historical information out there that would be really interesting, but which is actually very difficult for people to find. I've mentioned to a couple of people who speak Korean, yet the Korean government fortunately does make Admiral Yi Sin-shin's diaries available for download, but although they've been translated into English, but trying to find good scholarly works on Admiral Yi in English, yeah, have fun with that one. But again, I'm pretty sure there's some decent sources in Korean, but I don't know what they are because I don't speak Korean. So essentially what I'm getting at with this is, if you happen to be in a country that's essentially, well, even if you are in somewhere like Germany or France, but even more so if you're in countries that Britain has fought somewhat less and America has fought somewhat less, and there's good resources about a specific battle, a specific character, or your country's naval history in general, and you think that they would be interesting, especially, if there is an English language version, fantastic, but especially if there's not an English language version, then please feel free to let me know what these resources are, and ideally roughly what the translation of the title would be in English, because then I can go looking for them. Because if there is an English translation, I might very well find it if I'm looking for it, but I might not, so it's still worth telling me about. But if it purely exists in your language, I need to know about this so I can have a more complete understanding of world naval history, and I can bring that naval history to light to other people. It was only about 6 months ago that I had my eyes opened to further fields of Austro-Hungarian naval studies, in as much as a nice easy rule of thumb is to think of Austro-Hungarian naval development ending with the ersatz monarchs, because they're kind of like the Montanas or the Lions, etc. They're the class that was never built but was fully planned. But as it turns out, actually, the Austro-Hungarian design bureaus had multiple designs for multiple battleships and multiple battle cruisers well past the ersatz monarchs, much in the same way as actually you have the L-20E Alphas and so forth for the high seas fleet. But I'd not really ever heard of those, except for maybe vague hints in passing, until about 6 months ago. There's a whole video on what the Austro-Hungarian Navy wanted to do just in terms of its capital ships past the Tegethoff class. And let's face it, the Austro-Hungarian Navy is not the world's biggest navy in time or size. So what else is out there for other navies? Who knows? Good authoritative works about the Baltic wars between Sweden and Russia. Again, there's one or two in English, but you always want to have more than one or two sources to go with. So yeah, does that help? Robert Olweiler asks, what was the opinion of the Royal Navy brass on the US Navy in the interwar period, during World War II, and afterwards? Was there a point in which they realised that the Royal Navy had been truly eclipsed? It varied quite a bit from admiral to admiral, depending on what experiences that particular admiral had had during his career and while he was a flag officer with the US Navy, as well as kind of the influence of other officers that he'd perhaps advanced his career while serving under. So I wouldn't necessarily say there is a uniform opinion on the US Navy. Some officers who'd served alongside the US Navy during World War I, so going in, and then they're obviously applying this to their opinion in the interwar period, had the idea that the US Navy were pretty professional and good to work with. Others had the opinion that the US Navy was kind of a red-headed stepchild who needed some special help to try and do basic stuff like shoot straight. And, well, yeah, everything in between. During the interwar period, depending on political tensions, there was also kind of a swing back and forth of, are the Americans our enemies? Are they our friends? Are they our allies of convenience? And then during World War II, again, during the war, opinion, at least as far as I can tell from various admirals' writings, shifts back and forth a bit. And right near the beginning of World War II, there's this sense that Britain was the first to start rearming, start modernising its ships, and maybe that the Americans are a bit slow on the uptake. Then, as the US enters the war, obviously with Pearl Harbor and everything, there is something of a sense amongst some flag officers that the Americans, when the British are trying to pass on their knowledge that's been hard won, going, hey, we've just spent 2.5 years at war, here's some things you might want to know to improve your own ships. And again, this comes down to sort of interpersonal relationships. In some cases, the US Navy, both before official entry into the war and immediately after, in some cases was very happy to listen and to absorb those lessons and to incorporate them into their own fleet, at which point, obviously, those Royal Navy officers went, yes, the US Navy is capable of learning and fortunately will kind of be not necessarily entirely on our level, but mostly on our level. Now that they're joined with us, they just need a little bit of sharp-end experience to get them into shape, whilst at other times the lessons the Royal Navy was finding were just being not listened to or outright rejected, and that contributed to other flag officers thinking that the US Navy was a bunch of backward-looking idiots who were going to get themselves kicked left, right and centre by anyone who had a modicum of how to fight a modern naval war. And again, opinions all between those two extremes. Although this does tend to mellow out towards the end of the war, because obviously by 44-45, both navies have quite extensive combat experience. The Royal Navy is shifting more over to the Pacific, which has been very much the US Navy's playground. And I think the Royal Navy began to get a sense of the fact the US Navy was just flat out bigger than them round about that time that shift came along, sort of late 44, early 45. Although, whilst the Royal Navy was pretty much generally capable of acknowledging that, yes, the US Navy had eclipsed it by numbers by that stage, whether or not they acknowledged the US Navy had eclipsed them by quality per ship, that's an entirely different matter. When-if the Royal Navy ever has admitted that is a completely separate question. Tuning 3434 asks, considering that the Royal Navy was mostly gearing up its pre-World War II fleet for a war in the Far East and not taking the Kriegsmarine too seriously, the German invasion of Norway was a particularly tough pill to swallow. What effect did it have on the Royal Navy afterwards, and what was learned? Well, the Royal Navy, as with everybody else at the beginning of their involvement in World War II, was on something of a steep learning curve. As far as the Royal Navy was concerned, one of the big takeaways was something that you'd think would be fairly obvious, which is, don't let aircraft carriers wander around on their own with minimal escort. Thanks, loss of HMS Glorious. Other lessons that were learned were things such as Aircraft will go after your destroyers, even if there are other capital ships around. You probably want some higher elevation dual-purpose guns. Also, trying to carefully plan and execute airstrikes from your carriers as if it's peacetime and you can sit there and work out all sorts of complicated paperwork is not really a viable thing. You probably also want to invest in some control using your radar for your fighters, and that's kind of the Norway campaign is kind of the origin of the radar-directed fighter control that you will see later on in the Mediterranean, and which the Royal Navy will then teach to the US Navy. Also, intercepting warships with submarines, even if you know roughly where they're going to go, is pretty difficult. So, yeah, don't rely on it quite as much as you thought you were going to in order to down enemy capital ships. Whoever designed the skewer and the rock needs taking out back ASAP. Please, please, please get us some better carrier fighters. But in terms of surface-based gunnery combat, that the Royal Navy was pretty happy with. I mean, Warburton Lee's insert with his destroyers in the Second Battle of Narvik had accomplished a fair bit considering the relative size and age gap between his H-class destroyers and the German destroyers that were in Narvik. Of course, you had the Third Battle of Narvik with Warspite and company. They were pretty happy with that result. You know, some of the damage to some of the destroyers was a bit annoying, but hey, they'd achieved their objectives. Renown versus Scharnhorst and Gneisenau at Lofoten, although again they could have used a little less damage from the sea to Renown. It was still a case of, well, you know, we came off the best out of it. It shows aggression and good gunnery skills, so we're fairly happy with that. Essentially, if you want a sort of a very high-level analysis, the Royal Navy learned that almost everything it had assumed with regards to carrier air doctrine and use of carriers and anti-aircraft defense was either wrong or badly underestimated and needed massive revision very quickly. And some of what it thought about submarine warfare needed a bit of downplaying to more realistic expectations, but broadly speaking, their surface combat they were pretty happy with the exception of the sort of command decision loop to actually get ships out there to intercept in the first place. That they reckon needed a bit more work to get them in position to actually attack things in the first place, which, you know, is kind of helpful. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock, and indeed Drydocks for this month. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. If you've reached this far, you will get a little special notice, of course, that I will be heading over to the States in, well, by the time this thing goes live, 2 weeks, I think. Let me just double check the calendar. Yep, 2 weeks' time I'll be heading over to the States. I'll be in the Northwest, in the Seattle-Bremerton area, then in the central northern area, possibly Chicago area, it remains to be seen, and then I'll be wrapping up with the HINSA conference and then heading back home again, so a sort of 2-week-ish trip, which I'm definitely looking forward to, and well, I hope to see some of you there. I'll probably mention it in a few other episodes in the run-up to the flight. Any case, thank you very much for listening, and for those of you who are interested in an I Survived the Drydock t-shirt or medal, I am working on that, so by the time we roll round to the next Patreon Drydock, hopefully those will be ready for release. In any case, see you again in another video at some point. Thank you very much.